Open the door right now!
I'm disabled. I need a moment.
No more excuses! Open it now!
I'm trying, please. I can't move fast.
The Ring doorbell camera was already recording when the pounding started. What began as a peaceful Tuesday evening in a quiet residential complex was about to become a viral nightmare that would destroy one career and change another life forever. The timestamp on the security footage read 11:47 p.m. when the first aggressive knock echoed through the hallway. Inside apartment 3B, Sarah Collins was fast asleep, her wheelchair positioned beside her bed, where she had transferred herself hours earlier after her evening routine. Sarah had no idea that in the next 20 minutes, her life would be turned upside down by a police officer who made assumptions that would cost him everything. The footage that emerged from this encounter would rack up over 15 million views in just 48 hours, spark national outrage, and prove that sometimes technology captures the exact moment when power meets accountability. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. This story has everything: police misconduct, disability rights, viral video justice, and a settlement that sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Sarah Collins was 29 years old and had been living independently in her apartment for 3 years. Born with spina bifida, she used a wheelchair for mobility but lived a completely normal life. She worked remotely as a graphic designer, had a small circle of close friends, and took pride in her independence. Her apartment was specially equipped with accessibility features, and she had developed routines that allowed her to manage everything on her own. That Tuesday evening had been like any other. Sarah had finished work around 6 p.m., made herself dinner, caught up on some reading, and settled into bed by 10:30. She was a light sleeper due to some chronic pain issues related to her condition, but she had finally drifted off when the knocking began. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The sound was muffled and distant, but as it continued and grew more aggressive, she realized someone was actually at her door. Sarah reached for her phone to check the time. Nearly midnight. She felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. Who could be knocking this late? She lived alone and wasn't expecting anyone. Her family lived 2 states away, and her closest friend knew better than to show up unannounced, especially at this hour. The knocking became more insistent. Loud, rapid banging that echoed through her small apartment. Sarah maneuvered herself into her wheelchair, a process that normally took her about 2 minutes but felt like an eternity with someone pounding on her door. She grabbed her robe and made her way toward the front door, her heart racing. Through the peephole, she could see a figure in what appeared to be a uniform. The hallway lighting was dim, but she could make out the distinctive shape of a police officer. Her confusion deepened. She hadn't called the police. There had been no emergency, no disturbance from her apartment. What could they possibly want? Officer Daniel Rodriguez had been on the force for 8 years. He worked the night shift in a district that covered several apartment complexes and residential neighborhoods. By most accounts, he was considered a competent officer. Though some of his colleagues had occasionally noted his tendency to be overly aggressive in situations that didn't necessarily warrant it, tonight, he had received a call that would test every aspect of his judgment and training. The call had come in around 11:15 p.m. A neighbor in Sarah's building had reported hearing what they described as unusual noises coming from apartment 3B. The caller said they heard what sounded like someone falling or objects being thrown, and they were concerned about a possible domestic disturbance or break-in. The caller mentioned they thought a young woman lived alone in that unit. Rodriguez responded to the call without a partner, which wasn't unusual for what seemed like a routine welfare check. He arrived at the building, found the correct apartment, and began knocking. When no one immediately answered, he assumed the worst. In his mind, the lack of response confirmed that something was wrong inside. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah was physically unable to get to the door quickly. What he interpreted as suspicious silence was actually a disabled woman trying to safely transfer from her bed to her wheelchair and navigate to the front door. This misunderstanding would prove to be the foundation for everything that went wrong. Sarah finally reached the door and called out, asking who was there. Rodriguez identified himself as police and said he needed to speak with her. Sarah, still confused but wanting to cooperate, explained that she needed a moment to unlock the door. She had multiple locks for security, and maneuvering her wheelchair while reaching the various deadbolts took some coordination. To Rodriguez, this delay seemed suspicious. In his experience, innocent people opened doors quickly when police identified themselves. The fact that Sarah was taking what he perceived as an unusually long time only reinforced his belief that something criminal might be happening inside the apartment. Sarah managed to unlock the top deadbolt and was working on the chain lock when Rodriguez's patience ran out. Through the door, he demanded that she open it immediately. Sarah tried to explain that she was disabled and needed a moment to reach all the locks, but Rodriguez either didn't hear her clearly or chose to ignore the explanation. This is where the situation took a dramatic turn. Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of waiting for Sarah to finish unlocking the door, instead of asking for clarification about her disability, instead of calling for backup or a supervisor, he decided to force entry. The Ring camera mounted beside Sarah's door captured everything that happened next. The timestamp showed 11:52 p.m. when Rodriguez stepped back and delivered a powerful kick to the door. The chain lock snapped, and the door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall inside Sarah's apartment. Sarah, who had been positioned directly behind the door trying to reach the chain lock, was struck by the door and knocked backward in her wheelchair. The impact sent her tumbling to the floor, her wheelchair overturning and trapping her partially underneath. Rodriguez burst into the apartment with his weapon drawn, shouting commands for anyone inside to show themselves. What he found was not a dangerous criminal or a domestic violence situation. Instead, he discovered Sarah Collins lying on the floor beside her overturned wheelchair, wearing pajamas and a robe, clearly injured and terrified. The Ring camera continued recording from its position outside the door, capturing audio of everything happening inside the apartment. Sarah's voice could be heard, shaky and scared, trying to explain who she was and that she lived there. She asked Rodriguez why he had broken down her door and told him she was hurt. Rodriguez's response, captured clearly on the audio, would become the most damaging evidence against him. Instead of immediately calling for medical assistance, instead of apologizing for the mistake, he became defensive and aggressive. He accused Sarah of taking too long to answer the door and suggested she had been hiding something. Sarah, still on the floor and unable to right her wheelchair on her own, pleaded with Rodriguez to help her up. She explained that she was disabled and that he had injured her when the door struck her. Rodriguez seemed to interpret her distress as defiance rather than a legitimate medical emergency. The Ring camera recorded Rodriguez telling Sarah to stop making excuses and to get up on her own. When she explained that she couldn't because she was disabled and her wheelchair was overturned, Rodriguez accused her of lying and being dramatic. His exact words, preserved forever on the recording, were a string of insensitive comments about her disability that would later be played in court and analyzed by legal experts nationwide. Have you or someone you know ever been treated differently because of a disability? This story shows just how dangerous those assumptions can be. For nearly 15 minutes, Rodriguez kept Sarah on the floor while he searched her apartment without consent or probable cause. He went through her bedroom, her bathroom, her kitchen cabinets, looking for evidence of whatever crime he had convinced himself was taking place. He found nothing suspicious because there was nothing to find. Just the normal belongings of a woman who had been peacefully sleeping in her own home. During this time, Sarah's condition was deteriorating. The impact from the door had aggravated her existing spinal condition, and lying on the hard floor was causing severe pain. She repeatedly asked Rodriguez to help her back into her wheelchair or to call for medical assistance. Each request was either ignored or met with suspicion. The turning point came when Rodriguez finally called for backup, not because he realized his mistake, but because he wanted another officer to witness what he believed was Sarah's uncooperative behavior. He radioed for assistance with what he described as a difficult subject who was refusing to comply with lawful orders. Officer Jennifer Walsh arrived at the apartment around 12:15 a.m. Walsh had 12 years of experience and had received extensive training in disability awareness and de-escalation techniques. The moment she walked into Sarah's apartment and saw the situation, she knew something was terribly wrong. Walsh immediately recognized that Sarah was genuinely disabled and injured. She called for emergency medical services and began the process of documenting what had clearly been an excessive use of force during what should have been a routine welfare check. Her arrival marked the beginning of the end for Officer Rodriguez's career. The paramedics arrived shortly after Walsh's call and confirmed that Sarah had sustained injuries to her back and shoulder from the door impact and the fall. They transported her to the hospital for x-rays and treatment. As she was being loaded into the ambulance, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She told Officer Walsh about her Ring camera and gave permission for the footage to be reviewed. What happened next would expose not just one officer's misconduct, but a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked for far too long. The Ring camera footage was about to become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would reshape how police departments handle disability-related encounters and welfare checks. But the story was just beginning. The viral video, the internal investigation, the federal lawsuit, and the massive settlement were still to come. Sarah Collins had no idea that her worst night would eventually lead to justice, not just for herself, but for countless others who had faced similar discrimination and abuse. The Ring camera had captured everything, and in the age of technology, sometimes justice comes with a timestamp. The Ring camera footage reached the police department's evidence room at 3:47 a.m., just hours after Sarah was discharged from the emergency room with a prescription for pain medication and instructions to follow up with her doctor. What nobody expected was how quickly this routine evidence submission would spiral into a department-wide crisis. Detective Lisa Murphy was assigned to review the footage as part of the standard protocol for any incident involving injury to a civilian. Murphy had seen hundreds of body camera videos and security recordings during her 15-year career. She thought this would be just another routine review to clear Rodriguez of any wrongdoing and close the file. But when Murphy pressed play on the Ring camera footage, her expression changed within the first 30 seconds. She watched Rodriguez kick down the door. She heard Sarah explain her disability. She listened to Rodriguez's callous response to an injured woman on the floor. By the time she finished watching the full 20-minute recording, Murphy knew she was looking at one of the worst cases of police misconduct she had ever witnessed. Murphy immediately contacted her supervisor, Lieutenant James Harrison. Harrison watched the footage with Murphy and two other senior detectives. The room fell silent as they witnessed Rodriguez searching Sarah's apartment while she lay injured on the floor, begging for help. When the video ended, Harrison's first words were, "We have a serious problem here." Within 6 hours, Rodriguez was suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation. The department launched what would become one of the most thorough reviews in their history, not just of this incident, but of Rodriguez's entire career. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of an officer who had been operating with impunity for far too long. Internal affairs investigators found 7 previous complaints against Rodriguez involving excessive force or inappropriate behavior during welfare checks. All 7 complaints had been filed by people with disabilities, elderly individuals, or people from minority communities. Each complaint had been investigated perfunctorily and dismissed without meaningful discipline. One complaint from 2 years earlier described an incident remarkably similar to Sarah's experience. Rodriguez had forced entry into an elderly man's apartment during a wellness check, knocked the man down, and refused to believe the man's explanation that he was hard of hearing and had difficulty moving quickly to the door. That complaint had been dismissed because there was no video evidence, and Rodriguez's report contradicted the civilian's account. Another complaint involved a veteran with PTSD who Rodriguez had arrested after the man became confused and disoriented during a traffic stop. Rodriguez had interpreted the veteran's trauma response as suspicious behavior and had used unnecessary force during the arrest. Again, the complaint was dismissed with minimal investigation. The pattern was clear and damning. Rodriguez had a history of targeting vulnerable individuals and using excessive force against people who were least able to defend themselves or effectively complain about his behavior. The department had failed to recognize this pattern or take meaningful action to address it. Sarah, meanwhile, was dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath of her encounter. The injury to her back had aggravated her existing spinal condition, requiring additional medical treatment and physical therapy. But the psychological impact was even more severe. The trauma of being attacked in her own home by someone sworn to protect her had shattered her sense of safety and independence. Sarah's friend Maya discovered what had happened when she arrived for their planned coffee date the next morning and found Sarah's apartment doorframe damaged and Sarah herself barely able to move due to pain and emotional distress. Maya immediately recognized that this was more than just a case of police overreach. This was a civil rights violation of the highest order. Maya helped Sarah contact David Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases involving disabled individuals. Chen had built his reputation handling cases that other lawyers often overlooked, understanding that disabled victims faced unique challenges when seeking justice against law enforcement. Chen reviewed the Ring camera footage and immediately recognized its explosive potential. The video was crystal clear, the audio was perfect, and Rodriguez's conduct was so egregiously wrong that no jury could possibly excuse it. Chen also understood that this case had the potential to set important precedents for disability rights and police accountability. But Chen knew that winning in court was only part of the battle. He wanted to ensure this case sparked broader changes in how police departments train officers and handle encounters with disabled individuals. He reached out to several disability rights organizations and civil liberties groups, building a coalition that would amplify Sarah's story and push for systemic reform. The police department, realizing the severity of their liability, attempted damage control. They offered Sarah a modest settlement through her attorney, hoping to resolve the matter quietly before it attracted media attention. Chen advised Sarah to reject the offer. The amount was insultingly low, and accepting it would prevent them from pursuing the broader accountability they were seeking. 3 weeks after the incident, Chen held a press conference announcing the federal lawsuit. Sarah sat beside him, still using a neck brace from her injuries, as Chen outlined the case against Rodriguez and the police department. The Ring camera footage was shown to the assembled reporters, and their shocked reactions told the story better than any written statement could. The video went viral within hours. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with outrage over Rodriguez's treatment of Sarah. Disability rights advocates shared the footage with commentary about the systemic discrimination faced by disabled individuals. The hashtag demanding justice for Sarah began trending nationally. The public response was swift and overwhelming. The police department's phone lines were flooded with calls demanding Rodriguez's firing. The mayor's office received hundreds of emails calling for a thorough investigation of the entire department. Disability rights organizations announced plans for protests and demanded federal oversight of the police department's practices. Rodriguez, who had been suspended with pay during the initial investigation, found himself at the center of a national controversy. His name and face became synonymous with police brutality against disabled individuals. His personal social media accounts were discovered and scrutinized, revealing posts that many interpreted as showing bias against disabled people and minorities. The internal affairs investigation, initially expected to take months, was expedited under intense public pressure. Investigators interviewed Rodriguez extensively, and his explanations for his conduct became increasingly incoherent and defensive. He claimed he had felt threatened by Sarah's delay in opening the door. He insisted his use of force was justified based on the unknown risks of the situation. When investigators asked Rodriguez why he hadn't simply identified himself more clearly or asked about Sarah's circumstances before forcing entry, his answers revealed a troubling mindset. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why he should have accommodated Sarah's disability or why her need for extra time to reach the door was legitimate. The psychological evaluation ordered as part of the investigation raised serious questions about Rodriguez's fitness for duty. The evaluating psychologist noted concerning attitudes toward disabled individuals and a pattern of viewing accommodation requests as manipulation or defiance. The psychologist recommended immediate termination and suggested Rodriguez undergo extensive counseling before being considered for any position involving public contact. Officer Walsh, who had responded to Rodriguez's backup call, became a crucial witness in the investigation. Her testimony contradicted several claims in Rodriguez's initial report and provided an independent law enforcement perspective on just how wrong Rodriguez's conduct had been. Walsh described finding Sarah injured on the floor and Rodriguez standing over her, showing no concern for her well-being or recognition that he had caused her injuries. The neighbor who had made the original call also came forward with additional information that further undermined Rodriguez's version of events. The neighbor explained that the sounds they had reported were actually Sarah doing her evening exercises, a routine she followed to maintain her physical health. The neighbor had been new to the building and wasn't familiar with Sarah's disability or her daily routines. This revelation eliminated any justification for Rodriguez's aggressive approach. What he had responded to wasn't a domestic disturbance or break-in, but the normal sounds of a disabled woman maintaining her health and independence. His failure to properly investigate before using force highlighted his poor judgment and lack of basic police skills. The federal lawsuit, filed under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, sought both monetary damages and systemic reforms. Chen's legal team documented not just the immediate harm to Sarah, but the broader pattern of discrimination that Rodriguez's conduct represented. They argued that the police department's failure to properly train officers on disability issues and their inadequate response to previous complaints created an environment where violations like this were inevitable. Expert witnesses lined up to testify about the proper procedures for welfare checks involving disabled individuals, the psychological impact of police violence on vulnerable populations, and the systemic changes needed to prevent similar incidents. The case was building into a comprehensive indictment of how law enforcement agencies across the country handle encounters with disabled citizens. What started as one officer's terrible decision was revealing layers of institutional failure that went far beyond a single bad cop. The Ring camera footage had opened a window into problems that disability advocates had been fighting against for decades, and now the whole country was watching. The pressure on the police department intensified when Rodriguez's personnel file was leaked to the media. Internal documents revealed that supervisors had noted his aggressive tendencies in performance reviews, but had failed to provide additional training or closer supervision. One evaluation from 3 years earlier specifically mentioned Rodriguez's difficulty working with vulnerable populations. Yet he had continued to be assigned to welfare checks and domestic calls. The department's training records showed another glaring failure. Officers received only 4 hours of disability awareness training during their initial academy instruction, and there were no mandatory refresher courses. The training materials were outdated and failed to address the specific challenges faced by people with mobility disabilities, sensory impairments, or cognitive differences. Sarah's medical records, submitted as evidence in the lawsuit, painted a devastating picture of the lasting impact from Rodriguez's actions. The forced entry had caused herniated discs in her spine that required surgery and months of rehabilitation. Her doctor testified that the trauma had significantly set back her physical progress and independence goals that had taken years to achieve. More troubling were the psychological evaluations documenting Sarah's development of severe anxiety and panic disorder following the incident. She had become afraid to sleep in her own apartment, jumping at every sound in the hallway. The independence she had fought so hard to maintain was crumbling under the weight of trauma and fear. Mental health experts explained to the court how police violence against disabled individuals created compound trauma. Not only did victims experience the immediate physical and psychological harm, but they also faced the devastating realization that the people supposed to protect them viewed their disability as suspicious or threatening. The investigation expanded when other victims began coming forward. A blind woman contacted Sarah's legal team to describe an incident where Rodriguez had arrested her for failing to immediately respond to his commands, despite her explanation that she couldn't see his hand signals. A man with autism shared his experience of being tackled by Rodriguez during a mental health crisis because his stimming behaviors were interpreted as aggressive. Each new account followed the same disturbing pattern. Rodriguez would encounter someone whose disability affected their ability to comply with his demands in exactly the way he expected, and he would respond with force rather than understanding. The department's failure to recognize this pattern after multiple complaints showed a systemic indifference to the rights and safety of disabled citizens. The Ring camera footage had become a teaching tool for disability rights organizations across the country. Universities began incorporating it into criminal justice courses as an example of how implicit bias and inadequate training could lead to devastating consequences. Police academies started using it to demonstrate what not to do during welfare checks. Media coverage of the case brought national attention to the broader issue of police interactions with disabled individuals. Statistics emerged showing that people with disabilities were involved in nearly half of all fatal police encounters, despite representing only about 12% of the population. Sarah's case became a symbol of a much larger crisis in American policing. The police union initially defended Rodriguez, issuing statements about the split-second decisions officers must make and the dangers they face on every call. But as public outrage grew and more evidence emerged about Rodriguez's pattern of misconduct, the union's support began to waver. Union leaders recognized that defending Rodriguez could damage their credibility and make it harder to support officers in legitimate cases. Rodriguez's criminal defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been following his training and department policies. However, use of force experts testified that no reasonable officer would have kicked down the door of a disabled woman who was clearly trying to cooperate. The video evidence made it impossible to claim Rodriguez's actions were justified under any standard police procedure. The district attorney's office faced mounting pressure to file criminal charges against Rodriguez. Disability rights groups organized rallies demanding accountability, while Sarah's story continued to spread across social media platforms. The viral nature of the Ring camera footage meant that millions of people had witnessed Rodriguez's conduct firsthand, making it difficult for prosecutors to ignore the case. 6 months after the incident, Rodriguez was formally terminated from the police force. The department cited his pattern of excessive force, failure to follow proper procedures, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The termination hearing was brief, with the Ring camera footage serving as the primary evidence against him. But losing his job was only the beginning of Rodriguez's consequences. The state licensing board revoked his law enforcement certification, ensuring he could never work as a police officer anywhere in the state. Other states began implementing reciprocal agreements to prevent officers decertified for civil rights violations from simply moving to new jurisdictions. The federal investigation expanded beyond the individual case to examine the department's entire approach to disability-related calls. Federal investigators found that the department lacked proper policies for accommodating disabled individuals during police encounters. Officers had no guidance on how to modify their procedures for people who might need additional time or different communication methods. Training records revealed that the department's idea of disability awareness consisted mainly of outdated videos that portrayed disabled people as either inspirational figures overcoming adversity or as burdens requiring special accommodation. There was no instruction on the legal requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act or practical guidance for real-world encounters. The lawsuit discovery process uncovered internal emails that were particularly damaging to the department's case. Supervisors had joked about Rodriguez's aggressive approach, with one sergeant writing that Rodriguez doesn't take any nonsense from anybody, no matter what excuse they give. The email chain showed that Rodriguez's targeting of vulnerable individuals was known and tolerated by department leadership. Sarah's legal team also found evidence that the department had failed to properly investigate civilian complaints against Rodriguez. Complaint files showed cursory investigations that accepted Rodriguez's version of events without interviewing witnesses or reviewing available evidence. In several cases, supervisors had closed investigations without even speaking to the complainants. The pattern of inadequate investigations was so pronounced that federal authorities opened a separate civil rights investigation into the department's complaint handling procedures. This investigation would eventually lead to a consent decree requiring federal oversight of the department's internal affairs processes. As the case moved toward trial, the department's insurance carriers began pressuring city officials to settle. The Ring camera footage made Rodriguez's liability clear, and the pattern of misconduct evidence suggested the potential for massive punitive damages. Insurance executives warned that taking the case to trial could result in a verdict that would bankrupt the city's insurance fund. Settlement negotiations began in earnest 8 months after the incident. Sarah's legal team made it clear that any agreement would need to include not just monetary compensation, but meaningful reforms to prevent similar incidents. They demanded changes to training procedures, complaint investigation processes, and accountability mechanisms. The city initially offered a settlement in the low 6 figures, hoping to resolve the matter quickly and quietly. Sarah's attorneys rejected the offer immediately, pointing out that the medical expenses alone exceeded that amount, and it did nothing to address the systemic issues that had enabled Rodriguez's conduct. Media attention continued to focus on the case as settlement talks progressed. Sarah gave several interviews, always emphasizing that her goal wasn't just personal compensation, but preventing other disabled individuals from experiencing similar trauma. Her advocacy work had transformed her from a private citizen into a national voice for disability rights and police accountability. The Ring camera footage continued to circulate online, serving as powerful evidence of the need for reform in police training and oversight. Legal experts analyzed the video in detail, using it to illustrate how quickly a routine welfare check could turn into a civil rights violation when officers lacked proper training and accountability. The case had already sparked changes beyond Sarah's city. Police departments across the country began reviewing their disability training programs and updating their policies for welfare checks. Some departments implemented mandatory crisis intervention training that included extensive disability awareness components. But the most significant changes were still to come. The settlement negotiations would soon conclude with an agreement that would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide, establishing new standards for how police departments must train their officers and handle encounters with disabled citizens. The Ring camera had captured more than just one officer's misconduct. It had documented a systemic failure that was about to face a reckoning that would reshape policing practices across the country. The settlement conference took place in a sterile conference room on the 15th floor of a downtown office building. Sarah sat at one end of a long mahogany table, flanked by her legal team and disability rights advocates who had joined the case. Across from her sat representatives from the city, their insurance company, and a nervous-looking attorney who kept glancing at his phone as if hoping for an escape route. The city's lead negotiator opened with what he clearly thought was a generous offer: $400,000 and a promise to review department training procedures. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's attorney didn't even dignify the offer with a verbal response, simply sliding a folder across the table containing medical bills, lost wages, documentation, and expert testimony about the lifetime impact of Rodriguez's actions. What the city representatives didn't fully grasp was that this case had evolved far beyond a simple excessive force claim. The Ring camera footage had transformed Sarah's story into a national symbol of systemic discrimination against disabled individuals. Settlement discussions weren't just about compensating one victim anymore. They were about establishing precedent that would protect millions of disabled Americans from similar treatment. The insurance company's actuarial team had run the numbers extensively. If this case went to trial, the potential damages were astronomical. Punitive damages alone could reach 8 figures given the documented pattern of misconduct and institutional indifference. The Ring camera footage was so compelling that mock juries had awarded Sarah millions of dollars in every test scenario. More concerning for the defendants was the broader exposure this case created. Discovery had revealed similar incidents across the department that could spawn additional lawsuits. The federal investigation was uncovering practices that violated not just individual rights but potentially federal funding requirements under disability rights laws. Sarah's legal team had done their homework on comparable cases nationwide. They presented documentation of settlements and verdicts in similar situations, showing how courts were increasingly holding police departments accountable for disability discrimination. The legal landscape was shifting, and departments that failed to adapt faced severe financial consequences. The second day of negotiations brought a more realistic offer: $750,000 plus specific training reforms. But Sarah's team wasn't satisfied with vague promises about improved procedures. They wanted detailed, enforceable requirements that would fundamentally change how this department and others approached disability-related encounters. The reforms demanded were comprehensive and specific. Every officer would undergo 40 hours of disability awareness training annually, not the current 4 hours during initial academy instruction. The training would include practical scenarios, interaction with disabled community members, and legal requirements under federal disability rights laws. Complaint investigation procedures would be completely overhauled with independent civilian oversight. Any complaint involving a disabled individual would trigger automatic review by disability rights experts and federal civil rights authorities. The days of cursory internal investigations that automatically exonerated officers were ending. The department would also establish a specialized unit for responding to calls involving disabled individuals. These officers would receive extensive additional training in de-escalation techniques, crisis intervention, and disability accommodation requirements. The goal was preventing incidents like Sarah's before they occurred, rather than simply responding after harm was done. Perhaps most significantly, the settlement would require the department to track and publicly report statistics on police encounters with disabled individuals. This transparency would allow community oversight and early identification of problematic patterns before they escalated to Rodriguez's level of systematic abuse. The city's insurance carriers ultimately forced the settlement decision. The potential liability was simply too great to risk a trial, especially with the ring camera footage likely to be played repeatedly for jurors. The final agreement reached $575,000 in compensation for Sarah, but the reform requirements were worth far more in terms of long-term impact. Sarah's story proves that sometimes justice arrives with a timestamp. One ring camera changed everything, exposing not just one officer's misconduct, but an entire system's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Rodriguez lost his career, his certification, and his future in law enforcement. The department paid nearly $600,000 and committed to reforms that will protect disabled individuals for years to come. But the real victory was bigger than money. Sarah's courage to fight back sparked nationwide changes in police training and accountability. Her worst night became a catalyst for justice that reached far beyond her apartment door. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side.